Hello everyone, and welcome to a video on the gold standard. In this video I will be explaining some ideas on the gold standard as well as the history, applications, and why we don't use the gold standard anymore. So let's jump on into it. Now you may have heard of the gold standard before and ask yourself, well, what exactly is it? And the idea behind the gold standard is that we fix the value of currency to the weight of gold, usually an ounce of gold. And there are three types of this gold standard. The gold species standard, the idea that people exchange gold and coins, and this was more frequent in ancient times. The gold exchange standard, where we fix the value of money to the weight of gold. And more recently, the gold bullion standard has the same properties as the gold exchange standard, except for that we allow people to purchase gold from the government. So why do we have the gold standard? Why gold? Well, gold is really unique in a lot of different ways. It is finite, and there are plethoras of wonderful applications. A great example would be that every CPU in your computer has a small amount of gold used as a semiconductor. Now, we have been using gold coins as currency since about 643 BC, Lydia, or present-day Turkey. That's the oldest that we have seen the use of golden coins. And so the value of the coin was determined by the quality of the gold. And it wasn't until about 560 BC when the Lydians invented a way to separate the gold from the silver, and so the first truly golden coins were born. In the early 16th century, we see European countries send explorers to the New World in search of gold. And the objective was to return back to their home country with so much gold that their country would become very wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. So we see explorers like Cortez sail to the Americas, and he was incredibly ruthless in his pursuit of gold, and he eventually led to the massacre of many people in the Central Americas. And so here's a photograph of Cortez and the conquistadors. It looks like making agreements with the native peoples, and eventually he slaughtered them all. By 1914, almost every country had adopted the gold standard, but we will soon see a very important event. And in 1914 was the start of World War I. And so the gold standard was put on hold here. Well, why? That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked. The war had pushed countries into a state of total war, and so we see countries print more money to pay for the war efforts. And printing money causes what? Inflation. What? Inflation. And so at the end of the war, countries adopt the gold standard again for various reasons, but mainly to stabilize the exchange rates. And, oh my goodness, 15 years later, we see a worldwide Great Depression. And so this leads to the abandonment of the gold standard again. We see a slippery slope of events that cause economies to tumble further and further into economic turmoil, such as the increase of interest rates and high unemployment rates to the collapse of many companies. And so this is a very famous photograph of a family during the Great Depression living in the Hoovervilles. World War II was the main event that pulled the world out of the Great Depression. At the end of the war, representatives from the world's leading countries met together in Bretton Woods, Connecticut, to adopt a new economic policy that is still based on the gold standard. Since the United States was producing half of the world's goods at the time, the representatives agreed to tie the value of gold to the United States dollar at about $35 for 1 ounce. This system worked really well because it increased the stability of exchange rates and ensured relatively low inflation rates. And we're going to take a look at how it stabilized the exchange rate. So here's an interesting example. Let's say that Canada values 1 ounce of gold at $50. Therefore, we can write this mathematically as 1 ounce of gold is equal to 50 Canadian dollars. Now let's take Mexico. Mexico values 1 ounce of gold at 5,000 Mexican pesos. So mathematically, 1 ounce of gold is equal to 5,000 pesos. Well, we can use our transitive property, right? And say that 50 Canadian dollars is equal to 5,000 pesos. With a little bit of division, we find out that a Canadian dollar is equal to 100 pesos. and 1 Mexican peso is about 1 cent, 1.01 Canadian dollars. So the Bretton Woods system eventually was abandoned for two main reasons. In 1971, America suffered from a national trade deficit and increasing inflation. So once again, we abandoned the gold standard and allowed the dollar to float on the open market, where our dollar is only backed by the United States government. That means that it is not backed by gold. So what does that mean? What is the real worth of a dollar if it's not backed by gold? And so for this, we turn to Professor Good of Brown University. Now, Professor Good is an economist, and he said some really fascinating things that I wanted to highlight. And one of the things that he said was the United States dollar is essentially worthless. Faith is the only thing that gives the dollar its present day value. Now, this is true in many ways because we are not tied to the gold standard, and so we see that the end of the gold standard gives our dollar no intrinsic value. That is to say, it is only backed by faith. I wanted to include this chart to show that in 1971, the value of gold was about $38 an ounce, and so the abandonment of the gold standard led the value of gold to go absolutely bananas and increase at an exponential value. So today, gold is worth a little bit more, over $1,700 an ounce. And so, in conclusion, we see that no country uses the gold standard today. We see that historically, people will rush to gold in times of market uncertainty. And lastly, the United States dollar is not backed up by anything except for the faith of people like you and me. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.